Anyway, we're going to speak about William Ellery Channing today. And you know, Unitarian history differs from that of most denominations. If you want to know the history of Methodism, you begin with John Wesley and his brother Charles. Uh, if you want to know the history about the Quakers, you start with George Fox, or with Presbyterians, you read about John Calvin, or the Mormons, you read about Joseph Smith. If you want to learn about the Salvation Army, you learn about William Booth, who had been a Methodist minister. But Unitarians, we don't begin with any one specific person. Our movement, Unitarianism, goes back to the earliest, the earliest days of the Christian church. Not as a denomination, but as a belief system, so to speak. Unitarian ideas can really be traced back to Jesus, to Socrates, to early Christian theologians like Arius and Pelagius. In Europe, throughout the Middle Ages, we find groups sort of leaning toward Unitarianism. And if you've been attending my Unitarian Universalist history lessons every couple of weeks, we know that the movement sort of organized in the middle 1500s with people like Michael Servetus and Faustus Socinus and Francis David and King John Sigismund. And in this country, we find that Unitarianism was a very significant trend in the 1700s. Joseph Priestley, the British theologian and scientist, emigrated to the United States from England in 1794, and he organized a church in Philadelphia that, while it wasn't called Unitarian, was Unitarian in its belief system. And that church was attended by people like Ben Franklin and at times Thomas Jefferson. King's Chapel in Boston, if you've been there, was originally an Anglican church here in the United States. And in 1786, they left the ideas of Trinitarianism and became a Unitarian Anglican church for a while. They're no longer Anglican in their liturgy, but they are a Unitarian Christian church. In 1825, on May 25th, the American Unitarian Association was organized. And coincidentally, it was on the same day that the British Unitarian Association was organized. And so by 1825, Unitarianism was really, as a theology anyway, in churches, was becoming prominent. It was flourishing. And that theology became more developed and streamlined as it went along. And usually it's, I guess it's okay to say, it's usually only seminarians and religious historians who study and know much about the ancestors and the traditions of a faith system, right? Ours and others as well. We're usually the nerds who like to read about all those people way back when, and most people don't. They find it kind of boring and dry at times, and it can be, but I'm interested in it. But we learn about those people because we sort of stand on their shoulders as people of faith in our tradition. And so, as I sometimes do today, a little history. And again, it's about William Ellery Channing. He's perhaps the most important figure on the Unitarian side of our tradition's early history in America. What Channing preached in the beginning of the 19th century, during a time of religious division and a deep mistrust about faith. Well, he did preach that then, and the role of faith in public affairs was really personal spirituality. It was pivotal to the establishment of Unitarianism, and it remains very relevant for us today. right? Our personal spirituality, our own search for truth and meaning. Channing was born in Newport, Rhode Island in 1780, and he died in 1842. He was called to be the minister of Boston's Federal Street Church in 1803. He graduated from Harvard when he was 18 years old. And at that time, Harvard was primarily a theological institution. He went to Boston's Federal Street Church in 1803, and he served there until his death. And that congregation later moved from Federal Street in Boston to Arlington and Boylston Streets. And so now it's called the Arlington Street Church. If you ever go to Boston, you can visit it. You can see the original church as well. And as a young minister, Channing became associated with the more liberal side of what is known in our history as the Unitarian controversy. If you attend the history lessons, as I said, on Thursday nights, we'll be talking about that very soon, probably in our next session. The Unitarian controversy. And that controversy began at Harvard Divinity School in 1805, when the Reverend Henry Ware was appointed, who was a Unitarian, was appointed to fill an open theological professorship at Harvard. Most of the supporters of Harvard at that time were staunch Calvinists, and they were absolutely opposed to Henry Ware being appointed to fill the Hollis Chair, is what he filled at Harvard. And you may know that name if you've been a Unitarian for a while, if you've attended General Assembly, if you've ever seen any of the sermons that are delivered at General Assembly, you may know that we have a lecture that's delivered every year at General Assembly called the Ware Lecture, and it's named after the Reverend Henry Ware. And over the years, many New England churches had already split from Orthodoxy and had declared themselves at least in alignment with Unitarian ideas and Unitarian thinking. And as their numbers grew, Channing led the effort by a group of clergy who were serving those congregations, and he's the one that led them to form the American Unitarian Association. It was one of the two ancestral groups of what is today the Unitarian Universalist Association that our congregation belongs to. Remember, for some context, that America back then was mostly rural. Okay, it was a very Protestant nation. I remember in the 1950s, there was a religious historian, and his name slips my mind right now, but he wrote a very famous book about religious history in the United States. And in the 50s, even then, his idea of religious history in the United States was Protestant, Catholic, Jew. That's all he saw, even though it wasn't quite like that ever. But America at that time, in Channing's time, was very Protestant. And it was in the middle of a period known as the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening was an evangelical movement. We had had a first Great Awakening years before in the 1700s with people like Jonathan Edwards, the fiery Puritan minister, and people like him. And the Second Great Awakening happened as well in the 1800s, primarily starting up in upstate New York and in New England. In fact, it became such a big deal that there were these revivals going on and all these people running around doing revival meetings and people getting saved and all different new groups forming, like the Mormons and the Seventh-day Adventists and so on. All these different new groups were forming. It became so prominent, especially in Western New York, that years later, ministers would go and people wouldn't be interested because they'd had enough. They began calling it the burned over district, just like as if you had created a fire there. Only this had been a fire of religion for years. In Channing's time, the population of Boston was only about 43,000 people, which sounds to me mind-blowing that Boston was ever only 43,000 people, but it was. And most New England towns probably looked a lot like If you've been to Sturbridge Village, old Sturbridge Village, the tourist attraction up there, um, that's what they really looked like back then, around 1830. Slavery was still a fact in America, and Channing spoke out in opposition to slavery. And it was also the time when the transcendentalist movement that I've mentioned on occasion began to emerge in New England. And he was not a transcendentalist, but he had an appreciation for transcendentalism. He was really a little more conservative in that area. But what happened on May 5th in 1819, Channing had been called to deliver a sermon at the ordination of the Reverend Jared Sparks in Baltimore, Maryland. And the sermon was entitled Unitarian Christianity. And it's arguably the most important sermon in the history of Unitarianism. I don't say that lightly. It really is, because of what he said in that sermon. Now, Channing was really smart when he did this. He knew that Unitarian ideas were on the uptick, and that the conservative clergy, even the conservative Unitarian clergy, were a little nervous about making it so public. But the really conservative clergy, the Puritans, the Calvinists rather, and the Baptists and so on, they were not happy. And because Jared Sparks had graduated from Harvard, and so Channing goes to his ordination with this sermon entitled Unitarian Christianity. He already knew that this was going to be controversial. And even before he delivered the sermon, he asked Jared Sparks to make sure that the sermon was printed and published. And it was. And it was not only printed and published as a pamphlet, but it was printed and published in the newspapers. And it excited a whole controversy that happened around it. When he delivered the sermon, he spoke for about an hour and a half at the service. And that was actually pretty typical of ministers and sermons in those days to be that long. I promise that mine will not be as long as that, ever. But the reason it was that long is because when you think about it, it was really one of the few forms of entertainment, or one of the things that people could do on a Sunday back then, was listen to a good sermon. So, as I said, he had arranged with it for it to be published immediately. And he encouraged his liberal clergy friends who were Unitarians to also spread the message, which they did. And some people have called this the Pentecost of American Unitarianism. It didn't take long for what was to become called the Baltimore Sermon to live up to his expectations. And it's that sermon that I just want to speak about a bit. There were two main sections to the sermon. First, there was the way Unitarians approached the Bible. Like his liberal colleagues, he argued that reason needed to be applied and used to interpret the scriptures and to explore different theological questions. He took the Bible seriously, but not as a divine work. Like the Unitarians of his day, he believed that the authors of the Bible may have been inspired in some way, but that it was written by ordinary people. We have to remember also that at the time he was delivering this sermon, at the time others were studying the Bible in such a way and coming to a Unitarian idea, or looking deeper into questions of doctrine, that in Germany, what was happening, there was a lot of what they call German higher criticism, not only of the Christian scriptures, but the Hebrew scriptures. And were they really written by these people they say wrote them? Would Jesus have said this? Would this really be something that happened? And so German higher criticism was finding its way also to the United States, and Channing knew about it. He plainly says this, though, in his sermon. He says, the Bible is a book written for men. And remember, this is the early 1800s, so it's not gender, it's gender specific. Um, the Bible is a book written for men in the language of men, and that its meaning ought to be in the same manner as that of understood in the same manner as that of other books. And if God is infinitely wise, he cannot sport with the understandings of his creatures. In other words, you can't take some things literally and some things figuratively just because you don't like them. You have to really study and see, is it valid or not? God doesn't, like Einstein said, God doesn't play dice with the universe. Channing would say God doesn't play dice with the understanding that he wants his creatures or his creation to have about his word, what he believed to be his word. The second part of the sermon lays out 5 principles that he believed Unitarians follow. And we'll see how they sort of still are relevant to us today. He was trying to define just what being a Unitarian meant and what distinguished them from other Christians. Because at that time, don't forget, Unitarianism was a Christian congregation, a Christian denomination. The first and probably the most self-evident one that he laid out was the Unitarian rejection of the doctrine of the Trinity. And he makes it plain that the Bible nowhere supports the idea of the Trinity. He says the proposition that there is one God seems to us exceedingly plain. We understand it that there is one being, one person, one intelligent agent, and one only to whom underived and infinite perfection and dominion belong. Now, whether today or not we agree with them as far as the existence of God or what God is or how God is, remember, this is Channing speaking in 1815. His second principle is the absolute humanity of Jesus. For Channing, Jesus was not a part of the Godhead. He wasn't partly human and partly divine. He didn't become divine. He was born and he lived and he died fully as a human being. And to be sure, he viewed Jesus as a special person. He even calls him the Christ, the Messiah. But to make him out to be anything more than human would be, he says, to miss the point of Jesus' message and his mission. And so in more contemporary language, Jesus was, by the example of his life and through his teachings, one, he says, in whom God is fully met. He says, it is our belief that Christ's humiliation was real and entire, that the whole Savior and not a part of him suffered, that his crucifixion was a scene of deep and unmixed agony. As we stand round his cross, he says, our minds are not distracted nor our sensibility weakened. We recognize, he says, in the dying Jesus, but one mind. This, we think, renders his sufferings and his patience and love in bearing them incomparably more impressive and affecting than the system we oppose. Now, there's going to be a lot as I go on with these quotes by him. There's a lot to unpack and to understand for our modern ears. So just remember that. These are his opinions, and our modern ideas and our modern opinions don't necessarily jibe with them altogether anymore. We may even find some of them offensive to our ears today. So just keep that in mind. The third principle that he touched on was the moral perfection of God. Channing believed that salvation was all about moral progress, that salvation by character, as liberals would begin calling it, was what he believed in. He believed that human beings have a fundamentally morally good nature, with God who as the reference point. God for him was perfect. God is our reference point. And so just as Jesus said, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. And he says in his sermon, to give our views of God in one word, we believe in his parental character. We ascribe to him not only the name, but the dispositions and principles of a father. as I said, this may, for some of us, be uncomfortable to hear, but this is Channing's belief, and I may disagree with it. I may find it a little uncomfortable or offensive. So just keep that in mind. This is back then. We believe that he has a father's concern for his creatures, a father's desire for their improvement, a father's equity in proportioning his commands to their powers, a father's joy in their progress, a father's readiness to forgive and receive the penitent, and a father's justice for the incorrigible. We look upon this world as a place of education in which he is training men by prosperity and adversity, by aids and obstructions, by conflicts of reason and passion, by motives to duty and temptations to sin, by a various disciplines suited to free and moral beings, for union with himself and for a sublime and ever-growing virtue in heaven. So right there, there's something that we could spend a whole sermon unpacking, right? The idea of heaven, the idea of being tested by God, by a divine being, the idea of the fact that at this point he was a Unitarian, but still believed in heaven and hell. He was not a Universalist. His fourth point was regarding Jesus' mission, and it's tied up with the previous point. Channing believed that Jesus' mission was a salvific one, that Jesus was meant to save people, not because God sent him to die for our sins and be a sacrificial atonement, but rather, as he says, to effect a moral or spiritual deliverance of mankind. That is, to rescue men from sin and its consequences, and to bring them to a state of everlasting purity and happiness. Jesus' life and teachings are what mattered the most for Channing. For him, Jesus was a way shower, an example of how we sacrifice ourselves for our fellow human beings because we love them. And his final point emphasized the idea of moral virtue in our own lives. For Channing and those who listened to him, that meant, of course, the Christian life. But I think we would agree that it means for all people of all religions that it's important to live a moral and upright life. And naturally, a lot of things have changed over the 202 years since Channing delivered that sermon. Christianity, while important to our tradition, is no longer central to it. I would say it's just one of many paths that we honor, as it says in our 7 principles and purposes. The Bible is one of many books and sources of inspiration, but no longer the chief text. As we spoke last week, and I showed you some of the texts that I hold sacred. A lot of people hold those sacred. And don't forget, I want to hear which ones you have. So please send those to me. And next week, we'll start that weekly reader section I told you about. Once you get past the Christian language of Channing in this sermon and his other writings, we find a lot that still resonates today. The use of reason in our search for truth and meaning, to be a responsible search for truth and meaning. The idea that for most of us, Jesus was fully human, and that living a moral life is important, even if we don't believe in God, even if we don't believe in a sacred text or the teachings of a specific religious guide. And even though many you don't use the word God so much or are uncomfortable with it, we generally agree that we share a deep connection with something greater than ourselves, and that it's called by many names. The thing, I say, in which we live and move and have our being. I think Channing would probably be at home in our congregations today if he dropped in. He might be disappointed in the short sermons we give, but you never know. I think he would love the social and charitable work that we do, our social justice work and our racial justice work. he would probably be pretty shocked to see women in the ministry, because that wasn't something that happened in his day. But I think he'd get over it pretty quickly. He might be more shocked that Unitarians merged with Universalists eventually, because for him, hell was very real and heaven was very real. But I think he would understand how that all came about, how that merger happened. I think he'd probably be disappointed that there are still so few Unitarians in the world, and that so many mainstream denominations still hang on to those irrational doctrines about the Trinity and other things. He's an important person in our Unitarian Universalist history. He's an important person in American religious history, and I encourage you to read some of his writings, particularly this one, Unitarian Christianity. You can find it online. Our tradition today may be more diverse and complicated than Channing's or our other forebears could ever have imagined. But I think that they would agree that our diversity, what we believe as individuals, how we've changed over the years, is what makes us stronger. And so we need to remember to honor their memory by living out our faith every day. May it be so.
If you enjoyed this video, please like us on YouTube, subscribe to our channel, and click on the bell to be notified whenever we post a new video.